The fire crackled softly as our laughter echoed into the quiet night, the flames casting dancing shadows across our faces and onto the surrounding trees. The campsite was a dream, a secluded patch of flat ground deep in the Cascades, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to press in like ancient guardians keeping their eternal watch. Their massive trunks disappeared into the darkness above, where their branches intertwined to create a natural cathedral ceiling that filtered the pale moonlight. It was the kind of place where the outside world didn't exist. No cell service, no distractions, just us and the wilderness stretching endlessly in every direction. The isolation was exactly what we had been looking for, though later I would come to curse that desire for seclusion. There were 4 of us: me, Nate, Amanda, and Holly. We'd been close friends since college, sharing late-night study sessions and weekend adventures that had forged bonds we thought unbreakable. But as it often does, time had started pulling us in different directions: careers, relationships, and the general drift of adult life conspiring to create distance between us. This trip was supposed to be our reunion, a chance to disconnect from everything and reconnect with each other, to recapture some of that carefree spirit we'd had in our younger days. The first day had been idyllic, everything we'd hoped for when planning this escape. We'd spent hours hiking trails that wound through the pristine wilderness, our boots crunching on pine needles as we pointed out interesting plants and rock formations. The afternoon found us fishing in the crystal-clear river that cut through the valley, its cold waters refreshing against our skin as we fumbled with lines and hooks, more interested in the conversation than actually catching anything. As evening approached, we gathered around the fire, laughing over bad jokes and shared memories, while the sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The forest had felt alive in a comforting way, like it was welcoming us into its embrace. The gentle susurration of leaves in the breeze, almost like whispered greetings. That night, everything changed. The shift came gradually, then all at once, like watching storm clouds gather before the first lightning strike. It started innocuously enough, just as the fire began to die down, the logs collapsing into glowing embers that sent occasional sparks spiraling up into the darkness. Nate was poking at the remnants with a stick, his familiar profile illuminated by the fading light. He'd always been the most outgoing of our group, quick with a joke or a smile, but even he had grown quieter as the night wore on. Amanda sat cross-legged nearby, meticulously toasting a marshmallow to golden perfection with the patience of an artist. The firelight caught in her dark hair, creating a halo effect that seemed somehow ominous in retrospect. Holly, ever the intellectual of our group, was flipping through an old field guide she'd brought along, occasionally adjusting her glasses as she pointed out plants we'd passed on the trail. The mood was easy, the silence between us warm and familiar, filled with the comfortable weight of years of friendship. Then we heard it. A faint sound carried on the wind, barely perceptible at first, like a whisper just below the threshold of understanding. The breeze had picked up slightly, rustling through the canopy above with a sound like distant waves. At first I thought that was all it was, just the natural music of the forest at night. But as I focused, trying to separate the sounds, it became unmistakable. Low and rhythmic, it had the cadence of a chant, rising and falling in patterns that seemed deliberately structured. It was the kind of sound you'd expect to hear in the echoing halls of an old church, not the open wilderness. And its presence here felt fundamentally wrong, like finding a smartphone in an ancient tomb. I glanced at the others, and judging by their expressions, the slightly widened eyes, the tension around their mouths, I wasn't the only one who had heard it. Amanda's marshmallow had begun to blacken, forgotten in the fire as she stared into the darkness beyond our little circle of light. The shadows between the trees seemed to deepen, as if the forest itself was drawing back from the sound. "Did you hear that?" Amanda asked, her voice unnaturally quiet as she finally pulled her ruined marshmallow out of the fire. Her wide eyes darted toward the tree line, where the shadows seemed to grow darker with each passing moment. The question hung in the air, heavy with implications none of us wanted to face. "Probably just the wind," Nate replied, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. His hand had stilled. The stick he'd been using to poke the fire held motionless above the embers. Holly frowned, tilting her head as if straining to catch it again, her field guide forgotten in her lap. "That's not wind," she said, her academic's mind already trying to categorize and understand. "It's deliberate. There's a pattern to it." We sat in tense silence, ears straining to capture every sound. The chanting came and went, rising and falling like waves on some distant dark shore. It was just barely audible above the rustling of leaves. But that made it worse somehow. Like it was purposefully staying at the edge of perception, toying with us. It wasn't human. Not in any way that made sense. There was no language I could recognize. Just a sound that settled deep into your bones and made you feel unwelcome, like a stranger who's overstayed their welcome but refuses to leave. "Probably other campers," I said, more to reassure myself than anyone else. My voice sounded thin and unconvincing even to my own ears. "Maybe they're having some kind of weird group activity or something." But my explanation rang hollow in the darkness. We hadn't seen another soul since leaving the trailhead that morning, and the trail register had been empty except for our names. The wilderness around us had seemed completely uninhabited, which had been part of its appeal. Now that same isolation took on a more sinister aspect. Holly sighed and stood, brushing dirt from her jeans with hands that trembled slightly. "Let's just call it a night," she said, trying to inject some rationality into the situation. "It's late, and this place is already messing with our heads. Everything's creepier in the dark." Reluctantly, we agreed, though none of us wanted to be alone in our tents. One by one, we retreated from the dying fire, its warm light feeling increasingly inadequate against the pressing darkness. I lay in my tent staring at the nylon ceiling, the sound of my own breathing deafening in the confined space. Every creak of the trees, every rustle of leaves outside sent a jolt of fear through me, my imagination painting horrible pictures in the darkness. The chanting had stopped, but the forest felt alive in a way it hadn't before, as if countless unseen eyes were watching our camp. I told myself it was paranoia, that my mind was filling in the blanks left by the dark with fears dredged up from childhood camping trips and horror movies, but the unease wouldn't go away. The nylon walls of the tent, which had seemed so sturdy during setup, now felt absurdly fragile against whatever might be out there in the darkness. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear, and I drifted into a restless sleep filled with dreams of shadowy figures moving just beyond my field of vision. The morning brought little comfort. The early light filtering through the trees should have dispersed the fears of the night, but instead it only highlighted how wrong everything felt. Nate was in a foul mood, dark circles under his eyes as he muttered about something pacing around the tents all night. "It was probably just animals," Amanda offered, as she mechanically packed away breakfast, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. The coffee we made over the rekindled fire tasted bitter, and did little to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over the camp. We spent the day hiking a new trail, trying to recapture the easy joy of the previous day. But the comfortable camaraderie had evaporated like morning dew. The forest no longer felt serene or welcoming. It felt oppressive, the tall pines that had seemed so majestic now looming like silent sentinels standing guard over some ancient secret. The farther we walked, the quieter it became, the usual sounds of the forest falling away until all that remained was the crunch of our boots on the dirt path and our increasingly labored breathing in the thin mountain air. Holly and Amanda filled the silence with idle chatter about work and mutual friends, their voices too loud and brittle in the stillness. But Nate kept stopping to glance over his shoulder, his face tense with barely contained anxiety. When we returned to camp that evening, the mood shifted sharply from unease to something approaching terror. Nate found it first, a crude shrine tucked just beyond the clearing where we'd made camp. None of us had noticed it before, though it seemed impossible that we could have missed it. The structure was small, barely 2 feet tall, made of sticks and stones arranged in a triangular shape that seemed to follow some twisted geometric logic. At its center was a piece of cloth, darkened with what looked suspiciously like dried blood, its edges frayed and weather-worn as if it had been there for years despite its obvious recent construction. Nate's reaction was immediate and visceral. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice cracking with anger born of fear as he kicked at the structure, scattering the carefully arranged stones across the forest floor. The violence of his action seemed to tear a hole in the heavy atmosphere. "Don't," Holly hissed, grabbing his arm with surprising strength, her fingers white-knuckled against his jacket. "What if it's, I don't know, important to someone? Cultural or religious or—" She trailed off, clearly unsettled by the implications of her own words. The idea that someone, or something, had constructed this while we slept or hiked was too disturbing to contemplate. Amanda stood a few feet back, arms wrapped tightly around herself as if warding off a chill despite the warm evening air. "It's creepy," she said, stating the obvious in a small voice. "Let's just leave it alone. Please." The last word came out as almost a plea. Nate scoffed, but the unease was clear in his eyes as they darted between the scattered remnants of the shrine and the darkening forest around us. "It's probably just a prank," he said, his usual bravado falling flat. "Someone trying to freak us out. Locals messing with tourists or something." No one responded. We all knew how unlikely that explanation was, given our isolation. We ate dinner in silence, the air heavy with unspoken tension. The food tasted like ash in our mouths, but we forced it down, going through the motions of normalcy, as if that might somehow ward off the wrongness that had infected our trip. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds. But they weren't the usual nocturnal noises we'd expect. Faint footsteps seemed to circle the clearing, just beyond the firelight, moving with deliberate slowness. Every so often a branch would snap or leaves would rustle. But no matter how hard we stared into the trees, we saw nothing but shadows that seemed to move independently of the firelight's dance. When the chanting returned that night, it was closer, louder. It surrounded us, coming from all directions at once, making it impossible to identify its source. The sound seemed to resonate with something primitive in our brains, triggering fight-or-flight responses we couldn't control. I woke to it, heart pounding against my ribs like it was trying to escape, and crawled out of my tent on shaking legs. Holly and Amanda were already by the fire, their faces pale and drawn in the dying light. They sat close together, seeking comfort in proximity. "Where's Nate?" Holly whispered, her voice shaking with barely contained panic. I looked toward his tent, the flap hanging open in the slight breeze. Empty. The sleeping bag inside was twisted and disturbed as if he'd left in a hurry. We searched the campsite in a blind panic, calling his name in voices that grew increasingly desperate. The chanting grew louder with each passing moment, now interspersed with whispers that seemed to come from the very trees themselves. Words in no language I'd ever heard, yet somehow carrying meaning that made my skin crawl. Then suddenly, a scream tore through the night. Nate's voice, raw and desperate, filled with a terror I'd never heard from him before. The sound cut off as abruptly as it began, leaving behind a silence more horrifying than any noise could have been. We found the shrine again, perfectly reassembled, as if Nate's earlier destruction had never happened. But this time, his familiar worn baseball cap lay in the center, soaked with fresh blood that gleamed black in our flashlight beams. Amanda let out a choked sob and backed away, shaking her head in denial. "No, no, no, no." The words came out like a prayer. But if anything was listening, it wasn't anything we wanted to hear our prayers. Holly grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin hard enough to draw blood, though I barely felt it through the adrenaline. "We have to leave," she said, her voice tight with controlled terror. "Now." None of us argued. We didn't stop to pack. We ran blindly into the forest, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we tripped over roots and crashed through underbrush, guided only by our desperate need to get away. The whispers followed us, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and every so often I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows darting between the trees, always just out of direct sight. My lungs burned with each breath. My legs felt like lead, but fear kept me moving long past the point of exhaustion. By dawn, we stumbled onto a service road, our clothes torn and dirty, covered in scratches from branches we'd barely noticed in our flight. Exhausted, terrified, and one person fewer than we'd started with, we flagged down the first car we saw, an early morning Forest Service vehicle whose driver looked at us like we were insane. The police didn't believe us, of course. How could they? Our story sounded like something from a campfire tale or a horror movie, not something that could happen in the real world. They searched the area and found nothing. No shrine, no blood, no sign of Nate or whatever had taken him. It was as if he had never existed, though the empty space he left in our lives proved otherwise. The official report listed him as missing, possibly due to animal attack or accidental injury. But we knew the truth. I don't know what we heard in those woods or what took Nate. I don't know if it was something ancient that had always been there, waiting in the dark spaces between the trees, or something newer that had somehow found its way into our world. But I do know one thing with absolute certainty. We were not alone out there. Something had been watching us from the moment we arrived, playing with us like a cat with mice before finally taking what it wanted. And sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet and dark, I still hear the chanting. Faint and distant, but unmistakable. It echoes in the back of my mind, calling me back to those woods. In my darker moments, I wonder if part of me was left behind there, if whatever took Nate marked the rest of us in some way we can't see, but can never escape. I wonder if someday the chanting will grow louder, and I'll find myself walking into the forest, following it to its source. And I wonder if that's what happened to Nate in those final moments. If he heard the call and simply couldn't resist answering it. The others don't talk about it anymore. We've drifted apart again, but for different reasons now. Some experiences create bonds between people, but others shatter them completely, leaving behind pieces too sharp to hold. Sometimes I think about reaching out to Holly or Amanda, about asking if they hear it too, the chanting, the whispers, the call of whatever waits in those woods. But I'm afraid of what their answers might be. More afraid, perhaps, than I am of the thing itself. Because deep down, in the darkest corners of my mind where I try not to look, I know the truth. It isn't finished with us yet. It's just waiting, patient as the mountains themselves, for the right moment to call us back to its domain. The idea had been to disconnect, a weekend of no screens, no distractions, just the three of them in the quiet embrace of nature. Charlie had suggested it, convinced that unplugging would somehow bridge the growing chasm between them. He'd watched over the past year as his family had slowly drifted apart, each of them retreating into their own digital worlds. Julia spent her evenings scrolling through social media, while their teenage daughter, Tessa, seemed to exist primarily behind her bedroom door, the soft glow of her phone illuminating her face late into the night. A little time in the great outdoors never hurt anyone. He'd insisted during their family dinner, his voice carrying more optimism than he felt. Julia had exchanged a knowing look with Tessa, their skepticism evident in their shared glance. His wife had been hesitant, citing reasonable concerns about their daughter's resistance to camping, the weather forecast. and the remote location. But Charlie held firm, clinging to the belief that this weekend could be the reset they desperately needed. The drive to the campground had been tense, filled with Tessa's pointed sighs and Julia's nervous fidgeting. They wound their way through increasingly narrow roads, the ancient trees pressing closer with each passing mile. These weren't the manicured forests of state parks or popular camping destinations. These were old-growth giants, their massive trunks scarred by centuries of winters, their branches reaching across the road like gnarled fingers scraping against the car's roof. Charlie had specifically chosen this spot for its isolation, having discovered it through an obscure camping forum. Pristine wilderness, the post had promised, far from the tourist trails. Now, as they followed the deteriorating dirt road deeper into the forest, that isolation felt less like an advantage and more like a warning. They arrived in the late afternoon, the sun already beginning its descent behind the towering trees. The shadows seemed to pulse with each breeze, creating an unsettling dance of light and darkness across their chosen campsite. Charlie tried to ignore the way the forest seemed to close in around them, forming a natural amphitheater that made him feel as if they were being watched from all sides. Tessa stood beside their packed car, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her eyes darting between the dense undergrowth that surrounded them. "This place feels wrong," she muttered, but Charlie pretended not to hear, busying himself with unloading their gear. Julia gave their daughter a reassuring smile, but Charlie caught the tremor in her hands as she helped him unpack. Setting up camp became an exercise in forced cheerfulness. Charlie maintained a steady stream of dad jokes and camping anecdotes, trying to lift the heavy atmosphere that had settled over them like a shroud. The tent went up with minimal struggle, though Charlie couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching their every move, studying them with ancient, patient eyes. As twilight crept in, they gathered around the campfire, its warm light creating a small circle of comfort in the growing darkness. Charlie had always loved this time of day while camping. The way the fire's glow seemed to create a barrier between civilization and wilderness, between the known and unknown. But tonight, that barrier felt frighteningly thin. "It's quiet out here, isn't it?" Julia's voice barely carried over the crackling flames, as if she were afraid to disturb whatever lurked in the darkness beyond their circle of light. The absence of natural sounds was becoming increasingly noticeable. No crickets chirping their evening symphony, no owls calling into the night, not even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Charlie forced a casual shrug, though his skin prickled with unease. "It's just nature, honey. We're not used to it, that's all." The words felt hollow, even as he spoke them, a parent's reflexive reassurance that failed to convince anyone, least of all himself. The silence grew heavier as the night deepened, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Tessa had given up any pretense of enjoying herself, sitting so close to Julia that she might as well have been in her lap. Her eyes never stopped moving, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight with an intensity that made Charlie's stomach clench. When Julia finally suggested they turn in for the night, the relief in her voice was palpable. They hurried through their bedtime routine, the simple act of brushing teeth taking on an almost ritualistic significance, as if maintaining these normal, civilized behaviors could somehow ward off the oppressive wrongness that surrounded them. Inside the tent, they lay close together, their breathing synchronized in the darkness. Charlie stayed awake, listening to the unnatural quiet, his mind racing with possibilities he didn't want to acknowledge. He told himself it was just the stress of being away from civilization, the natural anxiety that came with being somewhere unfamiliar. But deep down, in that primitive part of his brain that remembered when humans were prey, he knew something was very wrong. The giggling started just after midnight. It came drifting through the trees like smoke, high-pitched and eerily playful, carrying with it an innocence that felt fundamentally wrong in this dark place. Charlie's eyes snapped open, his heart thundering against his ribs. He lay perfectly still, straining to convince himself he'd imagined it. But then it came again, closer this time, accompanied by the soft crunch of leaves under bare feet. With trembling hands, he unzipped the tent and crawled out into the night. The remains of their fire cast a dim red glow that did little to penetrate the darkness. The air felt thick, almost solid, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. And there, in the soft dirt around their tent, were the footprints, small, bare, human feet that had circled their shelter while they lay inside, vulnerable and unaware. Charlie's mind refused to process what he was seeing. They were miles from anywhere, deep in a forest that rarely saw visitors. There couldn't be children out here, not at this hour, not in this place. Yet the evidence was there, pressed into the earth like accusations, the tracks winding through their campsite before disappearing into the impenetrable darkness of the forest. He woke Julia with a gentle shake, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's someone out there. Kids, I think." The words felt absurd even as he spoke them, but Julia's eyes went wide with understanding, her hand clutching his arm with desperate strength. "Charlie, that doesn't make any sense," she breathed, but he could see in her face that she believed him. They both knew, on some fundamental level, that they had stumbled into something ancient and wrong, something that had been waiting in these woods for a very long time. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and vigilance. They huddled together, listening to the sounds that drifted through the darkness, giggling, the soft patter of bare feet on earth, and sometimes, most terrifying of all, the sound of children whispering in voices that were almost, but not quite, human. Morning brought no relief. The footprints had vanished, the ground around their tent smooth and undisturbed, as if the night's events had been nothing more than a shared nightmare. But the hollow-eyed exhaustion on Tessa's face told a different story. She hadn't slept, hadn't even closed her eyes, her body rigid with fear throughout the long night. They set out to explore the forest, partly because staying in camp felt impossible, and partly because Charlie desperately needed to convince himself that there was a rational explanation for what they'd experienced. The trail they followed was narrow and overgrown, winding deeper into the ancient forest like a thread through a labyrinth. The air grew thicker as they walked, heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something sweet and cloying that made their heads swim. Tessa stayed between her parents, her usual teenage independence, forgotten in the face of primal fear. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made her jump, her eyes wide and searching. It was Julia who spotted the first doll, hanging from a low branch like a grotesque fruit. The crude figure swayed gently in the non-existent breeze, its body fashioned from twisted twigs and leaves, its head a knot of forest debris that somehow managed to suggest features: empty eyes, a gaping mouth, an expression of perpetual surprise. What is that?" Julia's whisper carried a note of horror that made Charlie's skin crawl. He tried to dismiss it, to find some rational explanation, but the words stuck in his throat. The doll radiated wrongness, an aura of malevolent purpose that defied explanation. Julia reached up with trembling hands and took it down, holding it as if it might come alive in her grasp. The craftsmanship was primitive but deliberate, each twist and knot placed with obvious intent. It wasn't the work of children playing in the woods. It was something else, something that understood the power of symbols and terror. Their return to camp was marked by silence and growing dread. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing closer, their branches reaching down like hungry fingers. As darkness fell, they huddled around a fresh fire, though its light brought little comfort. The doll lay between them, a silent reminder that they were not alone in these woods. The giggling started earlier this time, as if whatever was out there had grown bolder, more confident. It circled their camp, drawing closer with each pass, accompanied by the soft padding of bare feet on earth. Tessa's cry of fear shattered the night, her fingers digging into Julia's arm hard enough to leave marks. Charlie grabbed the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. At first, there was nothing, just trees and shadows, playing tricks on their frightened minds. But then, as the light swept past a massive oak, they saw them. They were children, or something that had once been children. Half a dozen pale faces stared back at them from the darkness, their eyes reflecting the firelight like animals. Their clothes hung in tatters, their hair a mass of twigs and leaves, their skin smeared with earth and something darker, something that gleamed wetly in the firelight. They didn't move, didn't speak, just watched with an unnatural stillness that spoke of predators studying prey. Their faces held no expression, no hint of humanity or emotion, just an ancient, patient hunger that had nothing to do with food. Charlie tried to speak, to challenge these impossible creatures, but his voice failed him. The air grew thick with the sweet, rotting smell they'd noticed earlier, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. And then, between one breath and the next, the children were gone, melting back into the shadows as if they'd never been there at all. The family spent the rest of the night in a tight circle around the fire, feeding it constantly, desperately trying to keep the darkness at bay. They spoke in whispers, sharing theories that grew more fantastic and terrifying with each passing hour. Were these lost children? Spirits? Something else entirely? Something that had never been human at all? Dawn brought no answers, but it did bring the dolls. They were everywhere, scattered around the campsite like fallen leaves. Dozens of them, each unique, each twisted into positions that suggested agony or ecstasy, or both. They had appeared silently while the family huddled by their fire, too afraid to look into the darkness. Charlie picked one up, his hand shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. The doll seemed to pulse in his grasp, as if something lived inside its crude form, something that recognized him. Each figure was different, but they all shared the same basic form: twisted limbs, hollow eyes, faces frozen in eternal screams. "Charlie, we need to leave." Julia's voice cracked with fear, and for once, he didn't argue. They packed their gear in record time, leaving the dolls where they lay, too afraid to touch them more than necessary. But as they turned to leave, the giggling started again, closer than ever, filled with a terrible joy that made their blood run cold. They ran. There was no shame in it, no pretense of bravery or rational thought. They ran through the forest, pursued by the sound of children's laughter and the soft padding of bare feet on earth. The trees seemed to reach for them, branches snagging their clothes, roots rising to trip their feet. And as they fled, they understood at last what they had stumbled into. This wasn't just a forest. It was a hunting ground. And they had never been anything but prey, lured here by their own arrogance and ignorance. The feral children were waiting, as they had always waited, as they would always wait, patient and hungry and eternal, playing their games in the deep woods, leaving their dolls as warnings that no one ever heeded in time. And somewhere in that ancient forest, in the darkness between the trees, children's laughter echoes still, calling to those who would dare to venture too deep, who would dare to think themselves above the old fears, the old warnings, the old truths about what lives in the dark places of the world. The three of them made it out that day, though they never spoke of what they saw, what they heard, what they understood in those final moments of terror. But sometimes, on quiet nights, they hear it still, the soft sound of giggling, drifting through their dreams like smoke, reminding them that the feral children are always waiting, always watching, always hungry for new playmates to add to their eternal games. The grove seemed perfect at first. That's what haunts me most now. How seamlessly it lured us in. How completely we fell for its deception. It was hidden deep in the wilderness, nestled in a pocket of ancient forest, where the massive pines and spruces grew so densely their branches interwove overhead, creating a natural cathedral that blocked out not just the noise of the world, but any reminder that a world beyond these woods still existed. The trees themselves seemed to breathe with age, their bark thick and gnarled, telling stories of centuries past in patient silence. My boyfriend Ethan had discovered it on one of his father's old topographical maps from the 1980s, the yellowed paper marked with careful notations in faded blue ink. A simple X, labeled as secret spot, caught his eye, along with a brief note: perfect clearing, good water source. His father had apparently camped there several times before abruptly stopping his trips to the area. When Ethan asked him about it, his father just shrugged and mumbled something about the trails becoming too overgrown. Looking back, I should have noticed how he wouldn't meet our eyes when we told him our plans. We'd spent months planning this weekend getaway, our escape from the suffocating pressure of our jobs in the city, from the endless notifications that kept our phones buzzing like angry wasps, from the concrete and glass that had begun to feel like prison walls. Ethan worked in tech support, and I'd recently started at a law firm. Both of us were drowning in the kind of stress that makes you forget who you are beneath all the responsibilities. This trip was supposed to be our reset button, a chance to remember what it felt like to just exist without deadlines or expectations. The first day was everything we'd dreamed of, maybe more. The grove felt like a secret we'd stumbled upon, a pocket of untouched wilderness that had somehow escaped the march of time. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy in ethereal shafts, dancing on the forest floor in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like nature's own stained glass. A brook wound its way through the western edge of the clearing, its clear water moving with such pristine grace that you could count every smooth stone beneath its surface. The sound it made was almost musical, a gentle symphony that seemed to play just for us. We spent those first golden hours exploring the immediate area, marking the easiest paths to the brook, and setting up our campsite. Ethan had borrowed his father's old tent, a sturdy two-person Coleman that smelled faintly of cedar and memories. It took us longer than it should have to pitch it, our laughter echoing through the trees as we fumbled with poles and stakes. The forest seemed to welcome the sound, absorbing it into its peaceful silence. The real entertainment came when we tried to start the fire. Neither of us was particularly experienced with outdoor skills, and we'd forgotten to pack lighter fluid, a rookie mistake that Ethan insisted would make the experience more authentic. We spent nearly an hour gathering kindling and attempting to channel our inner survivalists, creating increasingly elaborate structures of twigs and dried leaves that refused to catch. My hands grew black with soot as I struck match after match, while Ethan continued to insist that the next attempt would definitely work. When the flames finally caught, just as the sun was setting, We celebrated like we'd accomplished something miraculous. The grove basked in soft orange light, and shadows began their slow dance around the edges of our camp. That's when the first subtle wrongness crept in, though I didn't recognize it for what it was at the time. The shadows cast by the trees seemed to stretch longer than they should have, reaching across the ground like grasping fingers. They appeared deeper too, somehow more substantial than ordinary darkness. I remember thinking how strange it was that I couldn't see through them to the forest floor, even when I shone my flashlight directly at them. They remained solid, impenetrable pools of blackness. The brook's gentle music underwent a transformation as well. What had been soothing in the daylight now took on a different character entirely. The water's rush began to sound like whispered conversations just below the threshold of comprehension, as if dozens of voices were speaking just quietly enough that I couldn't quite make out the words. I found myself straining to listen, then forcing myself to stop when I realized how unsettling the sound had become. Ethan remained oblivious to these subtle shifts in our surroundings. He was entirely focused on achieving the perfect golden brown marshmallow, his face illuminated by the campfire as he rotated his stick with surgical precision. The firelight caught in his dark hair and reflected in his glasses, making him look younger somehow, more vulnerable. I wanted to protect him from the unease growing in my chest, from the weight of the watching darkness. "Do you hear that?" I finally asked, unable to keep the question inside any longer. The words felt thick in my mouth, as if the grove's heavy air was trying to stop them from escaping. Ethan looked up from his marshmallow masterpiece, his expression puzzled. "Hear what?" He cocked his head, listening. The fire crackled, sending sparks spinning up into the darkness. I hesitated, suddenly aware of how foolish my fears might sound. "I don't know. Nothing, I guess." But it wasn't nothing. And even as I dismissed it, the wrongness pressed in closer. It was the absence that disturbed me most, the way the normal nighttime chorus of the forest had fallen silent. No crickets chirped their evening songs. No owls called from the branches above. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the grove in a bubble of unnatural stillness. When the fire began to die down, we retreated to the tent. Ethan fell asleep almost immediately, his breathing deep and regular, but I lay awake, listening to the silence that wasn't really silence at all. The brook's whispers grew louder in the darkness, and sometimes I thought I could almost understand what they were saying. Almost, but not quite. And perhaps that was a mercy. That's when I heard the footsteps. They came softly at first, so faint I might have imagined them. A deliberate crunching of leaves and twigs that spoke of weight and purpose. I lay perfectly still, my heart thundering so loudly I feared it might wake Ethan, who continued to sleep peacefully beside me, completely unaware of what was happening. The footsteps moved with measured precision, circling our tent in a perfect pattern. They weren't random or natural. They were methodical, intentional. Whatever was out there wanted us to know it was there. I counted 7 complete circles before the sounds faded into the distance, though distance felt like the wrong word in that place where space itself seemed to bend and twist. I didn't wake Ethan. Even now, I'm not sure why. Perhaps some part of me knew that acknowledging what was happening would make it more real, would give it a power we weren't prepared to face. Instead, I watched the darkness press against the thin nylon walls of our tent until the first pale fingers of dawn reached through the canopy. When I told Ethan about the footsteps over breakfast, his reaction was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd slept soundly through the night's strange events. He dismissed my concerns with the casual confidence of someone who's never had reason to doubt the natural order of things. "Probably deer or something," he said, pouring hot water over instant coffee grounds. Steam rose from his battered enamel cup, curling in the morning air like smoke signals. We're in the middle of the woods, Chloe. It's not like we're alone out here. He stirred his coffee with a plastic spoon, the scraping sound unnaturally loud in the grove's heavy silence. I knew he was trying to be rational, to ease my fears with logic and reason. But I'd heard deer before on camping trips with my family as a child. Deer moved differently. Their steps were lighter, more sporadic, with occasional bounds and pauses. What I'd heard last night had been too deliberate, too purposeful. Still, I forced a smile and nodded, not wanting to cast a shadow over our weekend. The grove seemed to have enough shadows of its own. After cleaning up our breakfast site, we decided to explore further into the forest. Ethan spotted what looked like an old trail leading away from the grove. Just a slight depression in the earth, really, marked by fewer undergrowth and the occasional broken branch. It seemed to wind deeper into the woods, and we followed it, marking our path with occasional piles of stones so we could find our way back. The further we walked, the more the forest changed. The trees grew closer together, their trunks twisted into strange shapes that seemed almost deliberate. The air became thicker, harder to breathe, as if the oxygen itself was being slowly replaced by something heavier. Even the light that filtered through the canopy took on a different quality, greener, older somehow, as if we were viewing the world through ancient glass. That's when we came across the first tree with the gouges. It was a massive pine, its trunk wider than both of us together could have embraced. Deep cuts ran down its bark in parallel lines, too uniform to be natural, too high to have been made by any animal we knew of. The wounds in the bark seemed fresh, with sap still oozing slowly like thick, amber tears. Weird, Ethan muttered, running his fingers along one of the gouges. I wanted to tell him to stop, to pull his hand away from whatever had marked this tree. But before I could speak, he wiped his hand on his jeans and continued walking. It's like nothing lives out here. He was right. We hadn't seen a single bird or squirrel since entering this part of the forest. No insects buzzed in the undergrowth. No spiderwebs stretched between branches. The forest felt empty, abandoned. Or perhaps not abandoned, but cleared, as if something had systematically removed all other life from this place. Around midday, we decided to head back to camp. That's when we discovered that the trail we'd been following had vanished. Not grown over or hidden, simply gone, as if it had never existed. Even our stone markers had disappeared. Ethan, ever practical, pulled out his phone to check the GPS, but the screen showed no signal. His compass spun uselessly in circles. "It's this way," he said with forced confidence, leading us through the underbrush. I followed close behind, my hand gripping the back of his jacket. We walked for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 30 minutes before emerging into a clearing and finding ourselves staring at the same gouged pine tree. Ethan's nervous laugh echoed strangely in the heavy air. "Okay, that's creepy. Let's try another way." But each new attempt led us back to the same spot. The forest seemed to be hurting us, using some impossible geometry to keep us trapped in its maze. With each failed attempt to escape, I felt the panic rising in my chest, squeezing my lungs until each breath was a struggle. We tried 3 more paths, each one carefully chosen to lead away from the marked tree. Each time we ended up back in the same place. The shadows seemed to be growing longer, though the sun hadn't moved in the sky. Or had it? Time felt strange here, stretched and distorted like a reflection in troubled water. "How is this possible?" I whispered, clutching Ethan's arm. The confidence had drained from his face, replaced by something I'd never seen there before. Real fear, the kind that strips away all pretense and leaves you naked before the impossible. By the time we finally stumbled back into our grove, and how had we found it when we couldn't find anything else? The sun was setting again. The shadows stretched across the ground like spilled ink, seeming to move independently of the light that cast them. The temperature had dropped dramatically, far below what was normal for early September in these woods. Our breath came out in visible puffs, though the day had been warm just hours before. "We'll figure it out in the morning," Ethan said, but his voice shook with uncertainty. "Let's just get some rest." Neither of us believed we would sleep, but the idea of continuing to wander in the darkness was even more frightening than staying put. We spent that night by the fire, feeding it constantly with every piece of wood we could find. Neither of us spoke about what would happen when we ran out of fuel. The silence of the forest pressed in around us, broken only by the crack and pop of burning wood, and the increasingly distinct whispers from the brook. The footsteps returned at midnight. I know it was midnight because I checked my phone obsessively, watching the minutes tick by with agonizing slowness. This time, there was no mistaking them for anything natural. They moved with purpose, circling our campfire just beyond the reach of the light. Sometimes they seemed to come from one direction, sometimes from many at once, as if multiple beings were moving in perfect synchronization. Ethan grabbed a burning branch from the fire, holding it out like a weapon. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Show yourself." The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving us in a silence so complete it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. Then, slowly, a figure emerged at the edge of the firelight. It stood impossibly tall, its form seeming to shift and flow like smoke, yet somehow more solid than the darkness around it. I couldn't make out any features, but I felt its gaze, ancient, cold, and hungry, in a way that had nothing to do with food. Ethan took a step forward, brandishing his makeshift torch. "Stay back," he yelled, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, reduced to nothing more than a whisper. The figure remained motionless, but the footsteps resumed, behind us this time. We spun around but saw nothing. More footsteps joined in, coming from every direction at once, as if the entire grove had come alive and was moving around us. The fire sputtered and dimmed, though there was no wind. The figure at the edge of the light seemed to grow taller, its edges bleeding into the surrounding darkness, until I couldn't tell where it ended and the forest began. "We need to go," I managed to whisper, though my throat felt like it was filled with ice. Ethan nodded, and we grabbed what we could, our phones, a flashlight, his father's old map. Everything else we left behind as we ran blindly into the woods. The grove seemed to twist around us like a living thing, the trees bending and shifting to form corridors that always led back to the center. Each time we thought we'd broken free, we found ourselves back in the clearing, our abandoned tent still standing, the fire still smoldering despite all logic and reason. Eventually, exhaustion won out over terror. We collapsed near the brook, its whispered voices now clearly audible, though still mercifully incomprehensible. That's when we saw them, the markers. Small cairns of stones arranged in perfect triangles, each one identical to the next. They dotted the forest floor in a pattern that seemed meaningful, though its meaning escaped us. They hadn't been there before. I was certain of that. But now they were everywhere, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, extending into the darkness between the trees. "We're not supposed to be here," I said, the words coming out in a rush of understanding. The grove hadn't been welcoming us, it had been tolerating us, and now that tolerance had run out. "We need to leave." Now. This time, Ethan didn't argue or try to rationalize what was happening. We followed the brook, hoping that water would eventually lead us to civilization. The sun rose as we walked, though the forest remained dark, the trees pressing closer with each step, their branches reaching down like grasping hands. When we finally stumbled onto the dirt road, I almost cried with relief. The ranger's truck parked nearby seemed like a mirage, too perfect to be real. We ran toward it, waving and shouting like survivors of a shipwreck, spotting a rescue boat. The ranger listened to our story without interruption, his weathered face unreadable. When we finished, he sighed deeply and shook his head. "You're lucky," he said, and something in his tone made me think he knew more than he was saying. Most people who get lost up here aren't found. I wanted to ask him what he meant. I wanted to know if he'd seen the figure, if he knew about the markers, if he understood what lived in that grove. But the words stuck in my throat. Some questions are better left unasked. Some knowledge better left unlearned. We never returned to the grove. We couldn't have found it if we tried, and we didn't try. Ethan's father's map disappeared sometime during our flight, and when we looked at official Forest Service maps later, we could find no clearing that matched what we'd seen. Sometimes I wonder if the grove still exists at all, or if it only appears to those it chooses, for reasons we can't understand. But I know what I saw, what I felt, what I heard in those whispered voices from the brook. And sometimes, in my dreams, I see that figure again, standing at the edge of the firelight, patient and eternal, waiting for the next visitors to stumble upon its secret place. In those dreams, I understand what the brook was trying to tell us, and I wake up grateful that we escaped before we could learn the true purpose of those stone markers and what they were counting down to. The trailhead for Emerald Grove was miles from the nearest town, tucked away in the heart of a sprawling national forest. Dense undergrowth choked the narrow path, and ancient oaks towered overhead, their gnarled branches weaving together to block out most of the autumn sunlight. It wasn't the kind of spot you'd stumble upon by accident. That was part of the appeal, and perhaps, looking back, part of the warning we should have heeded. I'd been camping with the same group of friends since college, and we prided ourselves on finding hidden gems for our trips, places off the beaten path where we could escape the noise of the city and feel truly isolated. We'd developed a reputation among our wider circle for discovering spots that seemed to exist outside of time, forgotten corners of wilderness that felt untouched by modern life. This year, Ian, the self-appointed navigator of our group, had found Emerald Grove. No crowds, no cell service, and no distractions, he'd said, grinning as he passed around printouts of the map, his eyes gleaming with that familiar excitement of discovery. Just us and nature. It was perfect, or so we thought. The group consisted of me, Ian, his girlfriend Megan, and my brother Drew. We packed light, knowing we'd need to hike several miles to reach the campsite Ian had scouted. The weather was clear, the air crisp with the first hints of fall, carrying that distinct scent of decaying leaves and damp earth that makes you think of ancient things stirring beneath the soil. We set off in high spirits, our laughter echoing through the trees before being swallowed by the dense forest. The trail wound through the woods like a serpent, barely visible in places where nature had begun to reclaim it. Towering trees filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground, creating shifting shadows that seemed to dance around our feet. The silence grew deeper as we ventured further in, broken only by our footsteps and the occasional distant call of a bird we couldn't identify. By the time we reached the campsite, nestled in a quiet clearing near a shallow stream that whispered secrets to itself, the afternoon was slipping into evening. "This place is amazing," Megan said, dropping her pack and stretching her arms toward the darkening sky. Her voice seemed somehow muted, as if the forest itself was dampening the sound. "Good find, Ian." "Told you," Ian replied, already pulling out the tent poles with practiced efficiency. His movements were confident, but I noticed how his eyes kept darting to the tree line. "No one's been here in ages. Look at the moss, untouched." Drew wandered to the edge of the clearing, his boots crushing the thick carpet of leaves that blanketed the ground. He was scanning the earth with the careful attention he'd developed during his years studying archaeology. "Looks like someone was here a long time ago," he said, pointing to a large, flat stone half buried in the dirt. "Maybe a fire pit?" We gathered around the stone, drawn by an inexplicable curiosity that in hindsight feels more like compulsion. It was rectangular and weathered, its surface pitted by countless seasons of rain and frost. Faint carvings etched into its surface caught the dying light, creating shadows that seemed to shift and move when viewed from the corner of your eye. At first glance, the markings looked random, but as I brushed away the dirt and leaves with trembling fingers, a pattern emerged that made my skin crawl. The carvings were primitive but deliberate, depicting stick figures arranged in a circle around a central figure holding something, perhaps a bowl or a fire, though the weathering made it difficult to be certain. The lines were crude, yet there was something unsettling about them that went beyond their simple execution. The figures appeared emaciated, their limbs thin and jagged, stretched in ways that human bodies shouldn't stretch. Their heads were too large, their fingers too long, and their poses suggested a desperate reaching toward the central figure. "That's weird," Megan said, her voice uncertain, barely above a whisper. She wrapped her arms around herself, though the evening wasn't particularly cold. "Maybe some kind of old warning." "Or art," Ian said dismissively, though I noticed he'd taken a step back from the stone. "People love to make up creepy stories about stuff like this. It's probably just historical. Adds character." He forced a laugh that didn't quite mask his unease. Still, none of us could deny the unease the carvings provoked. The stone seemed to radiate a subtle wrongness that made us all instinctively keep our distance. We pitched our tents a little farther from the stone than we might have otherwise, though no one acknowledged why we were doing it. That night, as we sat around the campfire eating freeze-dried meals that suddenly seemed tasteless, the conversation inevitably turned to the stone. The flames cast dancing shadows on our faces, and each crack of burning wood made us jump slightly, though we tried to hide it from each other. "Do you think it meant something?" Drew asked, poking at the fire with a stick. The embers swirled upward like angry fireflies. "Like a ritual or something? The arrangement of those figures." "Probably just an old marker," Ian said, but his usual confidence had ebbed. "A lot of indigenous tribes pass through areas like this. Could have been anything." He glanced over his shoulder at the stone, barely visible in the darkness beyond our fire's reach. Megan shivered, pressing closer to Ian. "It's just creepy, that's all. Those figures looked so hungry, like they were begging for something." I laughed, trying to lighten the mood, though the sound felt hollow in the heavy air. "Good thing we've got plenty of food, right?" We all chuckled, but the tension remained, hanging in the air like smoke. By the time we crawled into our tents, the stone was all but forgotten, or at least, we pretended it was. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of movement. At first, I thought it was Ian or Drew making a midnight trek to relieve themselves, but the sound was different. Faint, almost furtive, like something small scuttling across the forest floor. The noise seemed to come from all directions at once, a soft scratching that made my skin prickle. I sat up, my sleeping bag rustling loudly in the silence, straining to hear more. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence that felt expectant, watching. The next morning, Megan's voice broke the sleepy silence as she rifled through her pack, growing increasingly frantic. Did someone move my food bag? There was an edge to her voice that made us all fully awake instantly. "What?" Ian asked, rubbing his eyes and crawling out of their tent. "My food. It's gone. All of it." Her voice cracked slightly. "Everything I packed. The trail mix, the dried fruit, the protein bars. It's all just gone." Drew frowned, his forehead creasing with concern. "You're sure you packed it?" "Yes, I'm sure," Megan snapped, her fear manifesting as anger. "It was right here. I double-checked before we left. I always double-check everything." Ian sighed, trying to sound reasonable, despite the worry in his eyes. Maybe an animal got to it. A raccoon or something. "But nothing else was touched," Megan said, her voice rising in pitch. "My clothes, my gear, it's all here. Just the food is missing. And look." She held up her pack. Nothing torn, no claw marks, nothing disturbed except the food is gone. We searched the area but found no sign of the missing food. No scattered wrappers, no tracks, no evidence of animals. The ground around our campsite was undisturbed except for our own footprints. Reluctantly, we pooled our supplies to ensure Megan wouldn't go hungry. It was an inconvenience, we told ourselves, just bad luck. But none of us quite believed it. That evening, as the sun dipped below the treetops and shadows began to lengthen like grasping fingers, the unease from the previous night returned tenfold. None of us mentioned it directly, but the silence was heavier, the forest darker. The trees seemed to press closer, their branches reaching toward our clearing like skeletal hands. Drew broke the quiet, his voice tight with tension, as he pointed toward the stone. "Did that look different yesterday?" We followed his gaze, though part of me wanted to look anywhere else. The carvings were more distinct than before, as though the lines had deepened overnight. A new figure had appeared, another thin, skeletal form crouching near the central figure. Its pose suggested hunger, desperation, its stick-like arms reaching toward the central figure's bowl. "It's just the light," Ian said quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. His hand found Megan's and gripped it tightly. "The shadows are playing tricks on us." "Maybe," Megan murmured, but she didn't sound convinced either. She stared at the stone, her face pale in the gathering darkness. "But I swear those figures weren't so clear before." We ate in silence, the shadows of the forest pressing closer with each passing moment. The fire seemed dimmer than it should have been, as if something was drinking in its light. That night, I woke again, this time to the sound of something scratching. It wasn't the furtive movement from the previous night. This was deliberate, methodical. The sound came from outside the tent, a slow, steady scraping that made my teeth ache. My heart raced as I reached for my flashlight with trembling fingers, fumbling to turn it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and moss. The scratching stopped the instant the light touched the canvas, leaving behind a silence that felt almost hungry. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the tent walls, but nothing else disturbed the night. Nothing I could see, at least. By morning, things were worse. Ian's food bag was gone, as were several of Drew's supplies. A creeping dread settled over us as we realized this wasn't a coincidence. Something was happening. something we couldn't explain away with rational explanations about animals or careless packing. "It's got to be animals," Ian said, though he didn't sound convinced. His hands shook as he searched his pack for the third time. "There's no one else out here. We haven't seen another soul since we started hiking." "Then why didn't they touch anything else?" Megan demanded, her voice sharp with fear. "Why just the food? And how did they get it without leaving any traces?" No one had an answer. We turned our attention back to the stone, drawn to it despite our growing terror, and what we saw chilled me to the bone. The carvings had changed again, becoming deeper, more distinct. Another figure had joined the circle, their emaciated limbs reaching toward the central figure with desperate intensity. The stone itself felt different, colder than the surrounding air, its surface slick with dew that hadn't touched the surrounding ground. "I don't like this," Megan said, her voice shaking. "We should leave. Now." Ian hesitated, but eventually nodded, his face ashen. "Let's pack up." We left the campsite by midday, hiking quickly back toward the trailhead. But the forest felt different, altered in subtle ways that set our nerves on edge. The trees seemed denser than before, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the sunlight. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if we were walking through water. It was as if the forest itself was resisting us, trying to hold us back. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear we were lost. The trail had disappeared, replaced by uneven ground and thick underbrush that seemed to grab at our ankles with every step. Ian checked the map repeatedly, his movements becoming more frantic each time, but nothing matched our surroundings. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, his frustration mounting as he turned the map this way and that. "We didn't take any wrong turns. We've been walking in a straight line back the way we came." By nightfall, we had no choice but to set up camp again. Our remaining food was meager, but none of us had much of an appetite. The forest felt alive around us, watching, waiting. That night, I woke to a sound I'll never forget. It wasn't scratching or scuttling, it was chewing. Wet, rhythmic chewing, coming from somewhere beyond the firelight. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. A horrible mixture of grinding teeth and tearing flesh that made my stomach turn. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The sound was faint at first but grew louder, as if something was approaching through the darkness. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, my hand trembling so badly I could barely hold it steady. The beam illuminated the stone. It was there. Somehow, impossibly, the stone had followed us. Its carvings were clearer than ever, the figures now seeming to writhe in agony on its surface. A new addition had appeared, a crude image of a mouth, open wide as if to devour, filled with jagged teeth that seemed to catch the flashlight's beam and reflect it back with an unnatural gleam. The chewing stopped. I stumbled backward, shaking Ian awake with trembling hands. "The stone. It's here." His eyes widened as he saw it, the blood draining from his face. "How?" Before he could finish, a low growl rumbled through the clearing, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere. It was followed by the snap of a branch, too close, much too close. We huddled together, our flashlight beams darting wildly through the trees, casting jumping shadows that only made the darkness seem deeper. Something moved in the shadows, its shape shifting and indistinct, like smoke given form. The growling grew louder, and for a brief moment, I saw it. A figure, thin and skeletal, its hollow eyes fixed on us with an ancient, terrible hunger. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, its fingers stretching toward us like branches in the wind. We ran. I don't remember how we found our way back to the car. The forest blurred around us, the hours stretching endlessly as we stumbled through the darkness. Branches whipped at our faces. Roots tried to trip us. And always there was that sound behind us, that wet, hungry chewing that seemed to echo in our skulls. By the time we reached the trailhead, the first rays of dawn were breaking through the trees, though the shadows seemed reluctant to release their grip on us. We never spoke about the trip again. The stone, the carvings, the figure in the woods. They haunt my dreams, but I refuse to go back. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that chewing sound again, carried on the wind that whistles past my window. Whatever followed us in that forest, whatever hunger drove it, wasn't meant to be understood by mortal minds. If you ever find a stone carved with figures in a remote forest, leave it alone. Don't brush away the dirt, don't study the carvings, and above all, don't camp nearby. Some things are best left unfound, some hunger's best left unfed, because once they notice you, once they mark you with their ancient hunger, they never truly let you go. Even now, years later, I sometimes find my food missing from my kitchen, with no signs of forced entry. And in those moments, I swear I can hear something scratching at my walls, growing closer, always hungry, always searching, always remembering the taste of those who found its stone. The storm came faster than they expected, rolling over the mountains like a dark tide that swallowed the afternoon sun. Eric glanced up at the darkening sky, his stomach sinking as he watched the heavy clouds gather overhead. The forecast had called for scattered showers, just another mild autumn day in the mountains, but this wasn't a drizzle. This was the kind of storm that rolled in fast and stayed, the type that could strand hikers and flood valley trails. The first drops of rain hit the ground like warnings as he and Julie trudged down the overgrown path, each step taking them further from the marked trails they should have stuck to. "We should have started earlier," Julie said, pulling her red jacket tighter around her shoulders. She'd always been the more cautious one, the voice of reason that Eric usually ignored. "This is going to get bad." The weather service updated the forecast this morning. "We're almost there," Eric said, though he wasn't sure where there was anymore. The map on his phone had cut out when they lost service hours ago, leaving them to navigate the unfamiliar forest by instinct and his questionable memory of the trail guide. The path was barely visible now, a narrow dirt track winding between towering pines that seemed to lean inward, watching their progress. "Do you even know where we're going?" Julie asked, her voice sharp with barely controlled anxiety. "Of course," Eric said, forcing confidence into his voice, even as doubt gnawed at his gut. "It's just a little farther. The lookout point should be just past these trees." A gust of wind sent the rain sideways, stinging their faces like tiny needles. Julie sighed, a sound that carried years of frustration with Eric's tendency to push too far, take too many risks. "If we don't find shelter soon..." "There," Eric interrupted, pointing through the trees, relief flooding his system. A cabin. It was small and weathered, tucked into the base of a hill, like it had grown there naturally over centuries. Its roof sagged under the weight of years, and the wooden walls were dark with moss and rot that seemed to pulse in the growing gloom. A faint curl of smoke rose from the chimney, twisting in ways that defied the wind. Julie frowned, her forehead creasing in that way it did when she sensed trouble coming. "Someone's living out here, in the middle of nowhere." "Probably a hunting cabin," Eric said, stepping off the trail with more confidence than he felt. "Come on. It's better than staying out in this. We could get hypothermia." Are you sure? Julie hesitated, her eyes fixed on the cabin as if trying to see through its walls. What if they're not friendly? We're miles from anywhere. It's a storm, Eric said, though his own unease was growing. No one's going to turn us away. It's like an unwritten rule of the wilderness. The rain was falling harder now, soaking through their jackets as they approached the cabin. Water dripped from pine needles like tears, and their boots squelched in mud that seemed too dark, too thick. Eric knocked on the door, the sound dull against the damp wood. When no one answered, he knocked again, harder this time. "Hello!" he called, his voice almost lost in the wind. "We're just looking for shelter until the storm passes. Please?" Still nothing, though the smoke continued to curl from the chimney in impossible patterns. He tried the handle. It turned easily, too easily for a cabin this remote, the door creaking open on rusted hinges that shouldn't have moved so smoothly. The inside was dark and smelled of damp wood and mildew, but it was warm, unnaturally so, as if the cold couldn't penetrate its walls. A small fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. The room was bare except for a table, 2 chairs, and a bed pushed into the corner, all of them looking too well maintained for an abandoned structure. "Hello?" Eric called again, stepping inside despite his growing sense of wrongness. "Is anyone here?" The cabin was silent, but the silence felt alive somehow, waiting. Julie crossed her arms, lingering near the doorway like a cornered animal. "This feels wrong. Everything about this feels wrong." "It's just abandoned," Eric said, though he didn't believe it anymore. "Someone probably lit the fire for hunters or hikers. It's not a big deal. This happens all the time in these mountains." Julie glanced around, her brow furrowed as she cataloged details that didn't add up. "Then why do I feel like we're being watched?" They settled in reluctantly, hanging their wet jackets near the fire and unpacking their gear. The clothes steamed slightly in the heat, but the water seemed reluctant to evaporate completely. Eric tried to make conversation, to normalize their situation with small talk about work and weekend plans. But Julie was quiet, her eyes darting to the door every few minutes, as if expecting someone, something, to walk through it. By the time the storm hit full force, the wind howled around the cabin like a living thing, shaking the walls with impossible strength. Rain pelted the roof like stones, drowning out every other sound except their breathing and the steady crackle of the fire that burned without consuming its wood. The flames danced steadily, their warmth soothing despite the growing tension that filled the small space like smoke. "This place is creepy," Julie said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "It's too clean." Eric frowned, looking up from his attempt to dry his socks. "What do you mean?" She gestured at the walls, the floor, the table that looked recently wiped down. "Look around. No dust, no cobwebs, no signs of animals or weather damage inside. It's like someone just left, but everything's perfectly maintained. That's not how abandoned cabins work." "They probably did just leave," Eric said, though his voice wavered. "Hunters, remember?" Julie shook her head, her eyes reflecting the firelight in a way that made them look too bright, too aware. "Then where are they? Where's their gear? Their food? Their trash? People leave traces, Eric. There's nothing here except furniture that looks older than both of us, but somehow hasn't aged a day." Eric didn't have an answer. He stood, walking to the small window on the far wall, needing to move. to think. The glass was dirty, streaked with condensation, but he could just make out the dark shapes of the pines swaying in the storm. Something about the view unsettled him deeply. The trees felt too close, too still, despite the wind that should have been tearing at their branches. "It's fine," he said, turning back to Julie and trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "We'll leave in the morning. First light." Eric woke to a strange sound that cut through his uneasy dreams. It was faint at first, almost lost beneath the howl of the wind that hadn't ceased. A rhythmic thumping, steady and deliberate, coming from outside the cabin walls. The sound had weight, presence, purpose. He sat up, blinking groggily in the dim light, and realized with a jolt that Julie's sleeping bag was empty, the fabric arranged too neatly, as if she'd never been in it at all. "Julie!" he called, his voice cracking with sudden fear. The thumping stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that pressed against his ears like cotton wool. He grabbed his flashlight and stood, his heart pounding against his ribs like it was trying to escape. The fire had burned low, casting the room in flickering shadows that seemed to reach for him with dark fingers. "Julie!" he called again, louder this time, desperate for a response that would make sense. A whisper answered, soft and faint, coming from just beyond the door. It sounded almost like Julie's voice, but wrong, like someone trying to speak without understanding how human voices worked. Eric froze. The whisper wasn't Julie's voice, not really. It was too low, too sharp, the words twisting in ways that human tongues and teeth weren't meant to produce. The thumping started again, louder now, shaking the door on its hinges with a rhythm that felt ancient and hungry. He stepped closer, his flashlight shaking in his hand, the beam seeming dimmer than it should have been. "Who's there?" The whisper stopped, cut off like a record scratch. The door creaked, slowly, as if something was pressing against it with terrible patience. Eric stumbled back, his breath hitching in his throat as shadows moved beneath the door that shouldn't have been there in the firelight. Then the door swung open with impossible gentleness. The storm roared in, rain lashing against his face like claws. But there was nothing visible in the doorway, just the empty forest, shrouded in darkness that seemed too thick, too alive. He stepped outside, the cold biting through his clothes with malicious intent. "Julie!" he shouted into the night, his voice swallowed by the wind. The forest was silent, holding its breath. By morning, the storm had passed, though its effects lingered in ways that defied natural law. The forest was eerily quiet, the pines standing motionless against the pale gray sky that looked too close, too solid. Eric searched the cabin with growing desperation, but there was no sign of Julie. Her sleeping bag, her pack, even her boots were gone, as if they'd never existed. Only his memories proved she'd been there at all. He stepped outside, his heart pounding against his ribs like Morse code, spelling out a warning. The ground was soaked, the mud slick beneath his boots, but there were no footprints. No sign that anyone had walked there, no indication that the cabin had ever had visitors. Except for the carvings. They were shallow but precise, etched into the wood of the cabin's walls with impossible care. Symbols, strange and looping, like letters from an unfamiliar language that hurt his eyes to look at directly. Eric touched one, his fingers brushing against the rough grooves that felt warm despite the morning chill. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. He spun around, his flashlight sweeping across the trees that seemed to bend away from its beam. A figure stood just beyond the clearing, its form barely visible in the shadows that clung to it like a second skin. It was tall and thin, its limbs bent at angles that suggested joints weren't a requirement for movement. "Julie?" Eric called, his voice trembling with hope he knew was false. The figure stepped closer, and Eric's stomach turned as reality twisted around it. It wasn't Julie. Its face was smooth and pale like fresh snow, featureless, except for two dark holes where eyes should have been. Holes that seemed to go on forever, containing depths that the human mind wasn't meant to comprehend. It tilted its head, the movement sharp and unnatural, like a marionette being operated by someone who'd only heard descriptions of how bodies should move. Eric ran. He didn't stop until he reached the road, his lungs burning and his legs trembling with exhaustion and terror. His car was still parked where they'd left it, but Julie's was gone, though he clearly remembered them arriving in separate vehicles. He fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip them, and started the engine that caught with a sound too similar to that thing's whisper. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was standing at the edge of the forest, its head still tilted at that impossible angle as it watched him leave. For a moment, he thought he saw Julie standing beside it, but her form was wrong now. Her movements too smooth, her face too blank. Eric didn't look back again. The search party found the cabin days later, though some of them would later swear they passed the same spot multiple times before it appeared. It was empty. The fire long dead, though the ashes were still warm, the symbols etched into the walls in patterns that made experienced rescue workers turn away with sudden nausea. They found no sign of Julie, no footprints, no clues to where she might have gone. Just the carvings that seemed to change when no one was looking directly at them, and the faint sound of footsteps, circling the cabin in the quiet of the woods, accompanied by whispers that sounded almost like Julie's voice, but wrong, like someone wearing her voice like an ill-fitting suit. Sometimes, on stormy nights, hikers report seeing lights in those woods, a cabin that appears and disappears, and a woman in a red jacket standing in the doorway, beckoning them to come in out of the rain. But her movements are too smooth, her smile too wide, and those who look closely notice that her eyes are just dark holes, going down and down forever. The cabin is still there, they say, waiting for tired hikers and lost souls. The fire still burns, offering warmth and shelter from storms that roll in too fast and stay too long. But those who enter never leave. Not really. They just become part of the cabin story, their voices joining the whispers that circle in the dark, calling others to share their fate. And Eric? He moved to the desert, as far from forests and storms as he could get. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right, he hears that whisper again, speaking words that human tongues weren't meant to form. And in his dreams, he sees Julie standing in that doorway, her face smooth and blank, waiting for him to come home, to come back to the cabin that was never meant to shelter, only to keep. The trail to Pine Hollow wasn't marked on any map. Sam had found it in an old guidebook, weathered and dog-eared, tucked away in a used bookstore's forgotten corner. It was just a footnote at the bottom of a yellowed page about abandoned wilderness routes, but those few lines promised something rare in our overcrowded world: absolute solitude. The description painted a picture of pristine wilderness, a winding path through ancient forest and craggy hills, leading to a secluded clearing that few had ever seen. That was all we needed to hear. Our group of 4 had spent the past year planning this trip, our weekly meetings filled with maps and equipment lists and endless discussions about the perfect time to go. Sam, our self-proclaimed outdoorsman, had been obsessing over Pine Hollow for months. He'd spend hours poring over topographical maps, trying to piece together the trail's exact location from the guidebook's vague descriptions. Alyssa, with her expensive camera and artist's eye, couldn't stop talking about capturing the untouched beauty of a place that hadn't appeared on Instagram feeds or travel blogs. Then there was Marcus, our resident joker, whose wild theories about what we might find kept us laughing through the tedious planning sessions. And me, Emma, the eternal skeptic who agreed to come along mostly to keep the others from doing anything too reckless. But if I'm honest, I needed the escape as much as any of them. After a year of deadlines and responsibility, the thought of disappearing into the wilderness for a week, beyond the reach of cell towers and email notifications, had become an almost physical craving. We set out early on a Saturday morning in late September, when the air held the first sharp edge of autumn. The car was packed to bursting with supplies. Everything from basic camping gear to Sam's extensive collection of survival equipment. The drive took us deeper into the countryside than any of us had been before, past small towns that grew increasingly sparse until they disappeared altogether. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt, and finally to what barely qualified as a path. By the time we reached the unmarked trailhead, the sun had climbed high overhead, and the air was thick with the heavy perfume of pine sap and rich earth. "This is going to be epic," Sam declared, slinging his oversized pack over his shoulder with practiced ease. His eyes were bright with excitement, scanning the dense wall of trees before us. A whole week of nothing but wilderness. Epic or exhausting, I teased, adjusting my own pack's straps. The weight already felt daunting, and we hadn't taken a single step. He grinned, that familiar expression that always made his confidence seem contagious. "You'll see." The trail was barely more than a deer path, narrow and choked with undergrowth that caught at our ankles with every step. The trees pressed close on either side, their branches interweaving overhead to form a living tunnel. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in shifting patterns, creating an ever-changing play of light and shadow that made depth perception tricky. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots on fallen leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, and bird calls that echoed strangely in the dense foliage. We hiked for hours, stopping only when Sam needed to consult the map he'd carefully printed from the guidebook's descriptions. The paper was already showing signs of wear, creased and slightly damp from the humid air. By late afternoon, when the light had taken on the golden quality that precedes sunset, we reached the clearing, a natural meadow that opened up suddenly after a particularly dense stretch of forest. It was a flat, open space that seemed to have been carved perfectly from the surrounding wilderness, bordered on all sides by towering pines that stood like ancient guardians. "This is it," Sam announced, dropping his pack with a satisfied sigh that spoke of both relief and triumph. Home for the week. The clearing was more than idyllic. It was almost suspiciously perfect. A small creek, its water so clear you could count the stones beneath the surface, ran along the eastern edge. Thick moss covered the ground in irregular patches, creating natural cushions that seemed designed for camping. The air here was different too, cooler than the surrounding forest, and unnaturally still, as though the space existed in its own protective bubble. Alyssa immediately reached for her camera, the expensive lens catching the late afternoon light as she moved around the perimeter, capturing shots of the surrounding trees and the way the sunlight played through their branches. "This place is amazing," she breathed, her voice filled with the kind of awe usually reserved for grand cathedrals or perfect sunsets. "See? Told you it'd be worth it," Sam said, his satisfaction evident in every word. As we began setting up camp, I couldn't shake an uncomfortable sensation that grew stronger with each passing minute. It wasn't anything I could point to directly, just an persistent itch between my shoulder blades. A subtle unease that made me keep glancing over my shoulder at the tree line. I tried to rationalize it away. After all, we were miles from the nearest human being, surrounded by a forest that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. It was natural to feel exposed, vulnerable. Solitude, real solitude, had a way of playing tricks on the mind. That night, as we huddled around the campfire Sam had expertly constructed, Marcus took up his usual role as storyteller. It was a tradition on all our camping trips, and he approached it with the enthusiasm of a born performer. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face as he leaned forward, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone who knew exactly how to build suspense. "There's a legend about places like this," he began, gesturing to the dark wall of trees that surrounded us. "They say there's someone, or something, that watches over the forest. Not a ghost exactly, but not human either. A keeper of sorts. Something that's been here since before the first settlers arrived, before the first maps were drawn." Sam rolled his eyes, poking at the fire with a stick. "Let me guess. The lantern keeper?" Marcus's grin widened, revealing teeth that gleamed orange in the firelight. "You've heard it?" "Every woodsman has," Sam said, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't as dismissive as he was trying to appear. "It's just a story. A guy with a lantern who wanders the forest at night, watching over campers. Some say he's there to protect them from getting lost. Others say he's waiting to lead them astray. It's classic campfire stuff." "Why a lantern?" I asked, finding myself drawn into the story despite my usual skepticism. There was something about the darkness pressing in around our circle of firelight that made even the most ridiculous tales seem plausible. "Because it's old-fashioned," Marcus explained, his voice dropping lower, forcing us to lean in to hear him. "Classic creepy. You're walking through the woods at night. Maybe you've wandered a little too far from camp, and you see a flickering light in the distance. You think it must be another hiker, or maybe someone in trouble. So you follow it, thinking you're doing the right thing. But it's not what you think. It's never what you think." "Then what is it?" Alyssa asked, lowering her camera, which she'd been using to capture the firelight's effect on our faces. Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. The fire crackled, sending up a shower of sparks that made us all jump. "No one knows, because no one who follows the lantern ever comes back. They say he collects them, the lost souls, who wander too far into his domain. And on nights when the moon is dark, you can sometimes see their lights too, floating among the trees like fallen stars." We laughed it off, the way you always laugh at ghost stories around a campfire, but the laughter had a forced quality to it. Later, as I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the others breathing slow into the rhythms of sleep, I couldn't stop thinking about Marcus's story. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to make the shadows seem deeper, more substantial. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No wind stirring the leaves. No small animals moving in the underbrush. Just an oppressive stillness that made every small sound seem significant. And then I saw it. A flickering light, faint but unmistakable, shining through the trees at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't the harsh beam of a flashlight or the cold glow of an LED. Instead, it was golden, warm, like the flame of an old oil lantern, swaying slightly as though someone was carrying it through the darkness. "Sam," I whispered, reaching out to nudge him awake. My hand was trembling. "Sam, Do you see that?" He groaned, rolling over in his sleeping bag. His eyes were barely open as he squinted toward where I was pointing. "It's probably just another camper," he mumbled, though we both knew how unlikely that was. "There's no one else out here," I said, my voice tight with fear. "You said so yourself." His expression darkened as he came fully awake, his eyes fixed on the light that continued to move slowly between the trees. "It's nothing," he said finally, but his voice had lost its usual confidence. "Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. The light lingered at the edge of the clearing, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern that seemed almost ritualistic. It never came closer, never retreated further into the forest, just kept its silent vigil until exhaustion finally pulled me into an uneasy sleep, filled with dreams of golden light and endless trees. The next morning, over a breakfast that no one seemed particularly interested in eating, I told the group about what I'd seen. Alyssa tried to brush it off as a trick of moonlight, or my imagination working overtime after Marcus's story. But Marcus himself looked uneasy, pushing his food around his plate without eating. "Could have been a hiker," he suggested, though his tone made it clear he didn't believe it himself. "There's no one else out here," Sam repeated, but this time the words carried a different weight. "We're miles from the nearest marked trail. No one else knows this place exists." The unease followed us through the day, like an unwanted companion. We tried to stick to our planned activities. Alyssa wandered off with her camera to capture the morning light on the creek, while Marcus and Sam attempted to fish in the clear water. I stayed close to camp, organizing our supplies with mechanical precision, unable to shake the feeling that the forest itself was watching us, measuring our movements, waiting. When Alyssa returned from her photography session, her face was pale beneath her usual tan. Her hands clutched her camera like a lifeline. "I saw the light," she said without preamble. "What?" Sam's head snapped up, his face hardening into lines of concern. "While I was taking photos by the creek," she continued, her voice shaking slightly. "It was there, in the trees across the water. I thought it might be a reflection at first, or maybe light catching my lens, but it moved. It was moving like it knew I was watching it." Sam sighed, rubbing his temples as though fighting off a headache. "Look, it's just sunlight filtering through the trees. The forest can play tricks on you when you're alone. Nothing to freak out about." But as night fell, bringing with it a darkness that seemed thicker than natural, the light returned. This time, it was closer, its golden glow more distinct as it danced through the trees. It moved in slow, deliberate patterns that seemed to carry meaning we couldn't quite grasp. Marcus, trying to maintain his usual bravado, called out to it. His voice echoed strangely in the still air, but there was no response. The light didn't pause, didn't acknowledge us in any way. It just kept circling the clearing with mechanical precision, as if marking a boundary we couldn't see. "Do you want me to check it out?" Sam asked finally, reaching for his flashlight. The confident outdoorsman in him, warring visibly with an instinct that warned against approaching the unknown. "No," Alyssa said quickly, her hand shooting out to grab his arm. "Don't go near it. Please." Sam hesitated, then nodded slowly. We sat in tense silence around our campfire, watching the light until it gradually faded into the darkness like a dying ember. None of us slept much that night. The following morning, we made the collective decision to cut the trip short. The light hadn't directly threatened us, hadn't done anything more than watch, but its presence had worn away at our nerves until even the most mundane forest sounds made us jump. As we packed up camp, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The moss around the clearing, which had been so lush and green when we arrived, was charred in a perfect circle around our campsite. The blackened vegetation formed a pattern too precise to be natural, as though marked by fire. But there had been no fire, except our carefully contained campfire in the center of the clearing. "Let's just go," Marcus said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, when he saw what I was staring at. We followed the trail back toward where we'd left the car, but somehow the forest felt different than it had on our hike in. The trees seemed closer together, their branches reaching lower, creating shadows that seemed too dark for midday. The light didn't appear during our retreat, but I could feel its presence like a physical weight, watching our every step. That night, forced to make camp one last time before we could reach the trailhead, the light returned. It was brighter than before, more insistent, flickering between the trees like a warning or an invitation. Sam tried to ignore it, tried to maintain his role as the rational leader. But when the light began moving toward our camp for the first time, he stood abruptly. "Enough of this," he said, his voice hard with determination. "I'm ending this now. Whatever it is, it's just light. It can't hurt us." "Sam, don't," I pleaded, reaching for him. "Please." But he didn't listen. He grabbed his flashlight and disappeared into the woods, the beam of his light bouncing erratically as he followed the golden glow that seemed to retreat just ahead of him, leading him deeper into the darkness. We waited for hours, calling his name until our voices gave out, but there was no response. The light faded as it always did, taking with it our last hope of finding Sam in the darkness. None of us slept that night, huddled together in the center of our camp, jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest. By morning, we were exhausted and terrified. Alyssa and Marcus wanted to keep searching, but I convinced them that our best chance of helping Sam was to reach the trailhead and call for help. The forest felt actively hostile now, the trees pressing in like a living wall, branches catching at our clothes as if trying to hold us back. When we finally reached the car, rangers were already waiting for us, alerted by our overdue return. We told them everything, about the light, about Sam, about the charred moss and the feeling of being watched. They organized a search, but found no trace of him. No footprints, no discarded gear, no sign that he'd ever entered the forest at all. Months later, after the official search had been called off, and Sam's disappearance had become just another unsolved mystery in the Rangers' files, Alyssa showed me one of the photos she'd taken that first day in the clearing. It was a beautiful shot of the creek, the water catching the afternoon light in a way that made it look like liquid gold. But in the background, almost lost in the trees across the water, was a faint golden glow. And at its center, barely visible but unmistakable, was the silhouette of a figure holding what could only be a lantern. I don't know what happened to Sam that night. I don't know if he found what he was looking for in the darkness beyond the trees. But when I close my eyes, I see the light. It flickers at the edge of my vision, swaying like a beacon, calling me back to the forest, back to Pine Hollow, where something ancient still keeps its vigil among the trees.